Real natural disasters are not like the movies. Okay, sometimes they are, but that's the exception rather than the rule. Typically, when some huge disaster strikes, the really unlucky ones may find themselves fighting to survive, but the vast majority of us find ourselves fighting boredom. Everything is closed. Pandemics are scary on screen. In real life, as everyone watching this video knows, pandemics can be deadly, but for far more people, pandemics are deadly dull. This story is not like that. This story is exactly like a disaster movie. This story has stock characters and tropes you're familiar with. It has rising action, a climax, and a denouement. This is a Hollywood pandemic. This is about the institutions we trust, failing to protect us, failing in every imaginable way, foisting a deadly virus upon America and only being saved by sheer dumb luck. No, I haven't gotten red-pilled and taken the train to Conspiracy Town. I'm not talking about COVID. I'm talking about a disease that anyone living in the West is far less likely to catch than COVID-19, but at least in the 2010s it sparked at least as much hysteria. It's a virus known for dissolving your organs. People talk about it like it's the xenomorph from Alien. The truth is, it probably doesn't do that. And if it does, it's only in rare and extreme cases. What it really does is cause massive internal blood loss, which can and does often kill your organs while you're still alive. However, they remain more or less intact. It's more the neutron bomb of viruses than a tactical nuke, which in its own way is far more terrifying. I'm your host, Tor Parsons. These are my co-hosts, Jollibee the Durian and Thimble the Doll, and welcome to Tor's Cabinet of Curiosities. It's time for a quick lie. This one's from Ghoul. Horseradish is made with 100% real horse. Well, maybe for you it is, but not everyone can afford the fancy stuff. And we've got fan art. Mareep has two fantastic works of art inspired by the channel. Here's Tori Pearson and Jollibee the Durian and Guy Thimble. Himble! Complete with a knife. Speaking of Thimble, Mareep has also done Badass Action Heroine Thimble, complete with an even bigger knife. And from Tunny, here's Jollibee, bottom text. He's either having a bad day or he's baked. Not sure which is more likely. You can submit fan art on the Tor's Cabinet Discord, fan art channel, or through my socials listed below, and you can submit lies on the Discord lies channel. You get access to the Tor's Cabinet Discord by contributing to the Tor's Cabinet Patreon. I am sorry that you have to pay for the Discord, but with this upload schedule, I don't have time to make Patreon exclusive episodes. There are a few of those, but not enough to make the Patreon worth it for most people, I feel. And Tor's Cabinet is a labor of love. I'm proud of all these episodes. I want people to see them, and after devoting so much time and effort to making one, I don't want to lock it away behind a paywall. But Tor's Cabinet is also my full-time job. I put an average of 60 hours a week into it, and so I need to have some big perk that gets people paying for the Patreon. If it won't be more videos, it'll be the Discord. So I hope that's all right. It's an important part of how I put food on my family, in the inestimable words of our 43rd president, and it's not a decision I made lightly. So today, we're looking at the first Army-controlled viral decontamination operation ever performed on U.S. soil, and it happened right outside of Washington, D.C., in the quiet, leafy suburb of Reston, Virginia. Allow me to set the scene. 1989 was an interesting time to be alive. I wasn't alive then, but I didn't write most of this episode. The guy who did can remember it quite vividly. He says, "At the start of the year, George H.W. Bush became president. The Emperor of Japan died, but I was only 8 or 9 years old.
Most of what I remember was racing home after school to watch Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
In November, something else happened. The Berlin Wall came down. While people had been wanting it to happen for a long time, nobody expected it would until it did. The Simpsons didn't predict it because they hadn't spun off from the Tracy Ullman show yet. That actually happened during the weeks this incident was going on. Communism was dying, and America was on the rise to be the world's sole superpower. It was supposed to be a world without fear. Nobody told a bunch of crab-eating macaques that. Our story begins in early October 1989. Dan Dalgard, a veterinarian working at Hazleton Labs in Reston, Virginia, was in charge of overseeing a bunch of macaques in quarantine. Hazleton Labs is what's known as a contract research organization, a private company that carries out studies and tests on behalf of the pharma and biotech industries. Hazleton is now known as Fortrea, one of several name changes it's undergone since the incident. Part of that is because of mergers and acquisitions, part of that is because of fallout from the incident I'm about to tell you about, and part of that is to throw animal rights campaigners off their scent, because Hazleton has long been one of the most notorious animal testing outfits. They have labs all over the world where they keep dozens, sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands of monkeys in captivity to experiment on. Don't read about the things they've done. Please don't. I've already covered a lot of heavy subjects here, so I don't like to say that things are beyond the scope of this channel, but that's beyond the scope of this channel. It will ruin your day. I can only imagine what it must be like to love animals so much that you go through years of school to become a veterinarian, and then the job you end up getting is in a place like that. Frankly, that's where a lot of people who go through veterinary school end up. If you're lucky, you'll be in the job every 10-year-old girl dreams of having, but a lot of the world's veterinarians spend their lives inspecting cows in slaughterhouses and monkeys in pharma labs. Perhaps that's why veterinarians face suicide rates nearly as high as veterans. We don't know what Dan Dalgard thought of his job deep down, but on this quiet October morning in Virginia, Dalgard noticed 2 of the macaques were dead. At first, he thought nothing of it. Most primates, humans included, do not like being in captivity. Cage them up in a small area for too long and they get more aggressive. In his book, The Hot Zone, which will come up a lot in this video, author Richard Preston says that, quote, "If you put 2 male macaques in a small cage with no escape, only one of them will come out alive." 1 or 2 dead monkeys was considered normal, but these 2 were the first of many. Monkeys began dying every day. The number of dead monkeys was getting incredibly high, and those that weren't dying were showing signs of an illness that made them all but useless for the types of experiments Hazleton Labs needed the monkeys for. So now the higher-ups were interested. Come that November, the primate colony manager of the lab, a man named Bill Volt, told Dalgard that 29 monkeys had died in quarantine. Most of them in one particular monkey pen. Again, they didn't make anything of it because of something incredibly mundane. The building had issues with its heating and cooling system. They checked on the macaques, and sure enough, they had a fever. They were lethargic and had runny noses, but Occam's razor said that all of that could be caused by simple overheating and dehydration. Over the course of the night, 2 more macaques died. So Volt decided to dissect the monkeys himself, as you do. But what he saw made almost no sense to him. These monkeys had swollen spleens. If you don't know, the spleen is a small organ. It filters blood. It's one of those organs you can technically live without, but you probably wouldn't want to, since it's pretty important to the immune system. This is my interjection into the script, but my dad knew someone who had to have his spleen surgically removed. He had to take a lot of pills. The next morning, Volt called Dalgard in to get a second opinion. He agreed that everything else they observed in the monkeys could be explained away with them simply overheating. But heat stroke does not cause an inflamed spleen, which meant that the most likely cause was some sort of infectious agent. Of course, they were wrong about which one. They assumed it was a simian hemorrhagic fever. But again, you can't really blame them for that assumption. Real life is not an episode of House MD. If you have a given dataset and have 2 possible conclusions that match up, one being something you already know exists and the other being something you've barely even heard of, the logical conclusion is the known agent. When you hear hoofbeats, you think horse, not zebra, not run because the 100 duck-sized horses are after you. Now, simian hemorrhagic fever is no laughing matter. To you and I, it's nothing, because we're not simians, except for this Russian politician. It can't affect human beings at all. But it was known to kill off entire macaque colonies in a matter of months or even weeks. To make matters worse, the facility was scheduled to receive another order of monkeys later in the week, so they had to come up with a solution fast. Only, the more they looked at the data, the less sense the diagnosis made. So they decided to call in some experts. This was the right call. After all, it wasn't just Hazleton that could be dealing with whatever this was. Their monkey distributor, yes, there are monkey distributors, dealt with labs up and down the eastern seaboard. These other labs would need to be contacted so they could handle their own issues. Little did Dalgard know that with a few phone calls, he was setting into motion a chain of events that led to the permanent closure of his lab, the deaths of hundreds of monkeys, and the emergence of a terrifying new homegrown virus. Anyway, Dalgard called the United States Army Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, USAMRIID, for confirmation. After all, he knew that, at least at the time, they had one of the most sophisticated diagnostic labs on the planet. At least if you ask the U.S. Army, USAMRIID, which is based out of Fort Detrick, Maryland, was formed in 1969 to research defensive responses to biological warfare. They had sub-directives of going into foreign countries, usually U.S. allies or potential trade partners, and helping them contain outbreaks should something truly dangerous get out. But according to some, if not most historians, this isn't exactly the case. The Army already had an infectious disease program at Fort Detrick. When it opened is a matter of some debate. In 1989, the U.S. Army claimed the program was launched in the 50s. This is the time frame Preston went with in his book. Others place it in the late 1940s. It wasn't till the mid-90s, when documents related to what the U.S. government knew about the infamous Japanese military Unit 731, the Japanese BioWare division, that it came to light that the United States was engaging in research with biological agents from almost the moment they got into World War II. And the Army's original goals were not so high-minded and compassionate. Shocker. Yes, creating counteragents for bioweapons was part of their mission parameters, but the program was called the Biological Warfare Unit. If their name wasn't a dead giveaway, their main type of research wasn't so much a defense against biological weapons as they were about designing them. However, by 1969, President Richard Nixon was facing criticism for stuff that was going on in Vietnam. He would end up winning re-election in 1972 in a landslide, but this was at least partially because Nixon messed with the Democratic primaries so that the furthest left candidate George McGovern won the nomination, and partially because he got lucky as scandals engulfed other more electable Democrats like Ted Kennedy and Maine Senator Ed Muskie. At this point, early in his presidency, Nixon had to get his approval ratings up the old-fashioned way. He had to do something popular, and making Elvis an honorary agent of the Drug Enforcement Agency wasn't cutting it. Besides, the writing was on the wall. Most of the West was abandoning bioweapons. While not an official policy, the Russians and the US sorta had a "we won't use ours if you don't use yours" arrangement. An arrangement the Russians stuck to. So, Nixon signed not one, but 2 executive orders banning their use. Whether or not those rules were followed is in doubt, but on the surface it appears to have been the case. The United States is still a signatory on the United Nations Biological Weapons Convention, at least as of the time of this writing. By the time I've recorded and released this episode, who knows? The scientists at USAMRIID told Dalgard to come by with a sample. There was some miscommunication and he just sent them by courier in a frozen medical container. Can you imagine coming to work and finding a cooler with tinfoil containing things that look like blood-soaked deli meat on your desk?
Oh, look! A deli meat!
Well, the gang at USAMRIID didn't have to imagine it. Again, after running test after test, the Army concluded that it was simian hemorrhagic fever. But some of them joked that it must have been an extreme case, since some of the symptoms resembled Marburg virus, a serious hemorrhagic fever similar to Ebola, transmissible from monkeys to humans, discovered in 1967 when lab monkeys from Africa infected dozens of people in Marburg, Germany. Of the 32 people infected in the 1967 outbreak, 7 died. Meanwhile, Volt and Dalgard knew what simian hemorrhagic fever could do to a colony of monkeys and how agonizing it could be. On top of that, the symptoms were no longer contained to one room of the lab. It was infecting 2 of the other pens in the building. This led them to take a drastic measure. They euthanized all of the monkeys in the infected pen. But the weird thing is, they autopsied a large sample of them and found that most of them showed no signs of infection at all and appeared perfectly healthy. Which again was odd because SHF, simian hemorrhagic fever, and Marburg both tend to be the type of thing where their bodies are already in pretty bad shape when they become symptomatic. Thomas Geisbart was a junior member of the USAMRIID team. If this was a Hollywood movie, you would call him a stock character. He and his wife were separated because he was so consumed by his work. This left him more distant, more driven, and more of a risk taker. When he found out about the monkeys, a day or 2 later, he had to take a look under the electron microscope for himself. He saw things that hadn't been in the tissues initially, including blood and milky residue. When he looked at the samples, he said, "I don't know what that stuff is, but it is not simian hemorrhagic fever." So he took it to his boss, Peter Yarling. He assumed that the unknown agent was probably some common microbe contamination, possibly a Pseudomonas. These are little bacteria that grow pretty much everywhere, but they're most commonly found in dirt, unwashed vegetables, and under people's fingernails. It didn't smell like Pseudomonas. Yes, there is a smell test for Pseudomonas. They are said to have an odor kind of like red wine. Not all Pseudomonas have the scent, but it was common enough that they noticed its absence. The bigger problem was that it was right before most people at USAMRIID took off for Thanksgiving break. When Geisbert got home from his week off, he took a better look at his samples. He noticed that the cells weren't just dead, they were virtually unrecognizable as cellular material. But there was something he found even more disturbing. Yes, he was able to confirm the presence of simian hemorrhagic fever, but there was another virus present. Yes, you can have more than one active virus in your system at once. You usually do. It's called comorbidity. Happens all the time. In fact, entire families of viruses use the fact that one virus has already weakened your immune system to really wreak havoc. That's the principle behind things like AIDS. It is rarely what kills people directly, it's the fact that their immune system becomes so weak and the host's body can't fight off something that an uncompromised person could easily catch, fight off, show no symptoms of, and never know they caught. AIDS was first discovered when lots of people began coming down with Kaposi's sarcoma, a rare form of infection completely unrelated to AIDS in a biological sense. The tiniest infections can become a serious threat. Other viruses like to party together. This is true of things like hemorrhagic fever and filoviruses. Filoviruses are really nasty things to catch. These are some of the most dangerous infectious agents on the planet, and under an electron microscope they look worm-like. As far as anyone knew at the time, they were the only type of virus that looked that way. The tissue samples from the monkey were riddled with them, which is bad news. Back in 1989, there weren't that many filoviruses known. Since Geisbert was a junior member of the team, he was only familiar with two of them, Ebola and Marburg. Second, if people caught them, they were incredibly hard, if not impossible, to treat. They were extremely deadly. The only good thing you could say about them was that up until that point they were incredibly rare, but that's because they had managed to keep them mostly contained to Africa. Geisbert had done some math. He realized that the week before he had been handling these agents without wearing a protective suit. He breathed in the air without a mask. The incubation time for both Ebola and Marburg virus is between 6 and 18 days, and if he had so much as touched his face without washing his hands in that time, he could be infected. He might not even know for another week. So he did what any rational person would do. He freaked the fuck out. He eventually told Yarling. He kicked it up the chain of command. Now, the whole next part might seem unrealistic and straight out of Hollywood, but again, this comes from multiple public accounts of the incident. This is how it was. But first, tell me what you imagine when you hear the words commanding officer of a military medical unit. Well, if you're Gen Z or a millennial, you might think of Sigourney Weaver's character in James Cameron's Avatar. If you're of the generation of the author of this video, you probably think of one of two things. The kindly old Colonel Sherman Potter from the 70s and 80s sitcom MASH. I have never seen an episode of MASH, but I know what it is. Or Peter Coyote's character in E.T. Okay, I know E.T. You're closer to right going with Spielberg, but with the wrong movie. C.J. Peters was a self-described virus hunter who went around looking for deadly viruses in foreign countries. These days it was to contain them there so that they couldn't hurt our people at home, but he was really fond of local cuisine. The more exotic the better. This led him to have a bit of a weight problem, and while he was fond of the military paycheck, he was not particularly fond of their attire. Unless he was actually meeting with top brass, he wore socks with flip-flops, a pair of jeans with flashy Hawaiian shirts, and glasses. He was a yellow raincoat away from being Dennis Nedry from Jurassic Park. He took a look at the photos and was somehow unconvinced that it was a filovirus. While they're the only viruses that look like that, they aren't the only microorganism to look that way. They're bacteria that look similar. It took being shown the autopsy reports from the monkeys to convince him otherwise. Even then, his first thought was a lab leak. After all, on site they had samples of lots of the world's deadliest viruses for research. Only, he reasoned that the base's samples of Ebola and Marburg were held in a different area of the building in a very high security area with more than a dozen safeguards to prevent that very thing. While it wasn't impossible, he deemed it very improbable. On the other hand, at first glance, the strings of the virus looked a little bit too long to be Marburg or Ebola or any other known filovirus, which meant they could have their worst fear on their hands, a brand new filovirus of unknown danger and origin. At this point, Geisbert and Yarling did something that in hindsight they regretted. They didn't tell Peters that they might have been exposed. They had 3 reasons for this. The first being that Dalgard was exposed longer than they were and a few days before, so if he wasn't symptomatic, what were the odds they were? Second, they knew if they admitted it, they would be thrown into quarantine for at least 30 days. They had known people who had gone through it. Those who came out of it alive came out of it with all sorts of mental symptoms and eventually either left the USAMRIID of their own accord or failed a psych evaluation. The third is probably the worst. They thought that if it was a novel virus, they'd get to name it. They'd be the darlings of the virology community. They could coast off of media interviews, speaking engagements, and get cushy jobs as media spokespeople for USAMRIID for years to come, never doing any real virology again. So, instead of having a military doctor take their blood, they found a civilian consultant who owed them favors. Then they got to work taking a third shot at examining the tissue samples of the monkeys to make sure they didn't miss anything really important. Geisbert spent the next day looking at slices of monkey livers, seeing if he could find evidence that the virus was still active. And he found it. This meant beyond a shadow of a doubt that this wasn't contamination. This was an active filovirus. Meanwhile, Jarling contacted Dalgard and Volt. He confirmed their suspicion of simian hemorrhagic fever, but he told them of the possibility of another potentially dangerous agent. Dalgard and Volt had been working with macaques and other monkeys for a long time. They knew what other agents meant. They were worried, and would wait for confirmation. Jarling went to work testing the blood. He introduced their cultures and treated them with chemicals that, under the right conditions, including ultraviolet light, would glow. He tried the most likely candidate, Marburg virus, first. He got nothing. He did a test for Ebola Sudan, one of the 2 circulating strains of Ebola in Africa at the time. Again, nothing. But under the black light, the test for Ebola Zaire, the other strain, looked like a hotel room at a Motel 6. So of course, thinking there was a mix-up or a false positive, he did it again. When he got the same results a second time, he called Peters. The thing about the Army, even a scientific research unit, they still had to follow a chain of command. So they called General Philip Russell, who wasn't just in charge of this USAMRIID unit, but all the research units located on the base. Again, the first thing he did after getting confirmation was another well-worn Hollywood cliché. It was time for the Getting the Band Back Together montage. He assembled the greatest experts in infectious disease the Army had available. One of them, Nancy Jacks, had plenty of experience with Ebola. In fact, she had been part of a study, the results of which, again, at least at the time, had not been published, that confirmed people's worst nightmare. There was at least a small possibility that Ebola Zaire was transmissible through the air. It had at least shown the capability to do so from monkey to monkey. Since all the other transmission vectors could go from monkeys to people, she didn't doubt that it was possible. Of course, later CDC research on the matter put the Army's unpublished research in doubt. But this study was not good news. There was a question of if the Army really had any right to get involved in the process any further than it already had. If this had been the exact same virus in another country that it was asking us for our help, it would not be an issue. Their diplomats would work something out, and the US Army could go in there and decontaminate the monkey house. The problem was, the USAMRIID does not have jurisdiction to tackle a viral outbreak on US soil. On paper, there are provisions that allow them to declare martial law and seize control of any area, but those laws have never been exercised because the military's lawyers don't think the untested provisions would hold up to more than 3 seconds of scrutiny by a federal judge. Even Trump during COVID didn't try that. So, as a matter of law, that job belongs to the Center for Disease Control. Our modern-day COVID lockdowns are proof that then and now the CDC does not have quite the resources and near-infinite funds to handle a massive viral containment operation. They have all the legal power to declare quarantine, but no means to make those orders mean anything. On the other hand, it is an old adage in Washington that saying no to defense spending is political. The Army had the manpower, the technological resources, and capability to solve the problem, but chances are they could all be charged with criminal acts for trying to do so. Usually, it's good that their power is restricted like this. Under circumstances like these, less clear. However, Russell had one advantage. The guy who was head of the very division of the CDC that would theoretically have jurisdiction over the area was an old friend of his. He wanted this potential crisis solved without getting into, in his own words, a pissing contest. That's the one place where this whole thing isn't like a movie. This was in the late 80s, so in the Hollywood version, the military would go in guns blazing, shove the CDC guys aside, decontaminate the area, and then fade to credits with a song by a one-hit wonder hair metal band. Instead, they set up a meeting. Now, what they feared was they could have issues from 3 interested parties that you wouldn't expect. The EPA was in charge of the impact of any cleanup effort. It doesn't matter that whatever mess got left behind would be to cleanse the area of a virus that kills between 50 to 90% of the people who caught it, and that was potentially airborne and deadly. Rules are rules. After that, they'd have to clear it with not only the state of Virginia, but the Fairfax County Health Department. But the biggest group putting up a fight was Hazleton Labs. Dalgard and Volt sent the samples to the army when they thought it was simian hemorrhagic fever. When they thought it was Marburg, they were at least somewhat cooperative. Once it was this Ebola thing they had never heard about, they were a little more skeptical. They thought it was nothing, and it's easy to understand why. If you hear the word Ebola with zero context, it is an amusing sounding word. You know what else is a funny sounding word if you don't have context? Measles. Genocide sounds like a pasta sauce. But the reason I say you can't blame them is that this was 1989. The internet was not a thing. The two closest things we had were ARPANET, a precursor to the internet that was developed by the military agency now known as DARPA, which was used by the Department of Defense and some universities who undertook covert research projects, and BBSs. BBS, or bulletin board systems, were computer programs that connected to a phone line, much like old-school dial-up modems. They were used by a small number of people to communicate electronically. They had message boards and games with horrible ASCII graphics. They were used by a select few computer geeks of the late 80s and early 90s. Most BBSs were local numbers, but most system operators knew one other operator in another state, meaning that if you were willing to wait a few hours, you could relay a message from one part of the country, or even the world, to another. While you could find news and message boards on almost any subject matter, most BBSs wouldn't let you look up just anything, just things related to whatever that BBS's interests happened to be. There were BBSs for Star Trek, there were BBSs for bicycle races, and to prove that the first law of the internet actually predates the internet, yes, there was porn. Lots and lots of pixelated, often poorly photo-edited porn. The one thing there was not a BBS for was deadly viruses. Oh, there was plenty of discussion about viruses on the boards, but it was the electronic kind. So, while you, the viewer at home, could go online and type the word Ebola into your search bar and find a long, detailed description of the virus, what it does, how it operates, from sources varying from the great thicket of 4chan and Alex Jones to the Wikipedia pages, or even documents about it from the CDC or USAMRIID, somebody living in 1989 would not have been able to do that. Yet somehow, someone leaked the story there. But since very few people other than elite computer geeks used BBSs, it went unnoticed. Oh, and the author of this script would like to point out that having to write this, something that had been one of his greatest pastimes back in 1991-92, makes him feel really old. And I'll interject, yep, it sure does. Dalgard didn't want Peters and Jax going in, at least at first. Then he got some news. One of the people who worked in the monkey pens had a heart attack and was in the hospital. While it sucked for this guy, this was great news for the army. They had told Dalgard how Ebola can cause blood clots, which can cut off blood flow to various organs. Now there was proof. This frightened him so much that he allowed them in to take more samples, provided that nobody came barging in wearing moon suits. Of course, Peters and Jax made no illusions about things. They said that sooner or later, that was what it was probably going to take to get rid of this thing. Dalgard took a very, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it approach.
I say we take off and nuke the entire site from orbit. It's the only way to be sure.
And he called the guy's doctor. He told them if anything unusual came up, to contact Peters or Jax at Fort Detrick. At no point did he say the E word. Then he got a lot of double-sealed quarantine body bags filled with dead monkeys and loaded them into Peters' car. That's right, a live and potentially dangerous virus simply loaded into the back of a normal truck. Of course, whether they knew it or not, they were engaging in one of the Army's traditional cultural ways, raw-dogging biohazards, a tradition older than USAMRIID itself. They had all heard stories about how back in the good old days of the Biological Warfare Unit that live anthrax was driven across the country. Whether they knew it or not, those were not just stories. While Jax and another doctor took the macaques into the Level 4 quarantine room to do the autopsies, Russell had his meeting. Dalgard was to explain all the symptoms he saw and represent Hazleton Labs and the interests of all the various parent companies. Russell's friend from the CDC was there, as well as a guy named Bill McCormick. Remember the pissing contest Russell was trying to avoid? Well, yet again another Hollywood trope rears its ugly head. Russell and McCormack were well acquainted back during the days when they were both actual hot agent hunters rather than desk job administrators. They did not exactly get along. McCormick thought the Army was putting the public in danger by not sharing the results of their tests with various viruses, if they even bothered writing papers at all. For all they knew, the Army could be sitting on effective treatments for all sorts of conditions in the name of national security. And he may not be entirely wrong. On the other hand, Russell thought that McCormick coasted on the fact that he is the credited discoverer of the Ebola virus. McCormick not only co-discovered the virus, he risked exposure in order to treat an outbreak in Sudan back in 1979, amid the First Sudanese Civil War. So, Russell and McCormick's dislike for each other led to a bit of a Rashomon situation. Two very different accounts of what happened at the meeting. Both of them are extremely biased in one agency's favor. The truth will never be known, but is probably somewhere between the two extremes. Everyone who was at the meeting on behalf of the Army says that the CDC behaved dismissively of the Army's work and just marched in ready to take the job. Meanwhile, the people from the CDC claim the Army was, no surprise, acting aggressively as if they should be in charge. The Army pointed out that the closest place at the time that the CDC could contain something like Ebola in a safe manner was all the way in Atlanta. That's a long way from DC. A lot could go wrong transporting samples, and that could cause the very thing the CDC hoped to avoid, a threat to the public. Meanwhile, Fort Detrick was only an hour or two away. The CDC countered with, well, we have a new test for Ebola that only takes 12 hours. The Army, especially Yarling, didn't believe this. It took days to test for Ebola. And even if it worked, perhaps in the middle of a potential outbreak might not be the best time to use an untested technique. After hours of back and forth, they reached a compromise, and it was a compromise in the classic sense of nobody getting what they want. The CDC would handle and treat any human cases of Ebola that resulted from the outbreak. However, technically, the CDC only has a real responsibility for the health of human beings, so the monkeys and the monkey house would be the Army's problem. But Russell did have one ace up his sleeve. The fact that the Army already had test samples, and while they were all arguing, the fact that his people were already doing the test was intentionally never brought up. Again, there are reasons, one being that the fact that they were doing so might have been illegal. So Peters began getting the gang together for the job. Montage time! For the team leader, he chose Nancy Jack's husband, Jerry Jacks. It wasn't a nepotism thing. Jerry Jacks was an accomplished veterinary scientist with an extremely action hero-ready name. He couldn't not participate. Jerry Jacks pulled in a guy named Gene Johnson, and they came out with the objectives of the mission. Number 1, protect the general public from exposure. Number 2, euthanize the monkeys as humanely as possible. Number 3, collect samples of the virus so they can identify what it is and how it transmits, preventing it from ever happening again. Only essential laboratory workers were supposed to be at the Reston lab. Of course, when they got there, that wasn't the case. A lot of the staff who might have been exposed wanted to know how much danger they were in. Dahlgard had been briefed on what the Army told them, but they wanted verification. They were told that doctors from the CDC would get in touch with them shortly. The other thing they found was that the whole place smelled of death and monkey turbulence. Every monkey in the place was visibly ill, so they created a clean room inside the building. Hazelton Labs didn't want uniformed Army officers and people in any sort of biohazard suits visible to the public because they were still a private company, and this was going to hurt their bottom line. The Army was all too willing to go along with that for a totally different reason. They were afraid of triggering mass panic. Adding the chaos of people fleeing the nation's capital in droves would do nothing but increase the potential for the virus to spread and put a strain on public resources in a huge number of ways. Other than a few rumors on the proto-internet, the public didn't know yet, and the threat to the public, while real, was not yet dire. Public hysteria over the virus would most likely be far worse than the virus itself. So, the only way Hazelton Labs would allow the Army to go in and stop the outbreak of a potentially lethal virus was if they took every possible precaution to at least attempt to keep it out of the media. We'll get to how well they did in just a minute. Jackson and his team spent a better part of the day setting up and creating a changing area so they could get into cleanroom gear, including those plastic seals. They duct tape a one-way entry into place and everything. Seems pretty professional, right? Wrong. There was when yet another thing that you would think is really bad writing if you saw it in a movie happened. They forgot to check if the room they had sealed off had more than one entrance. As for the attempted media blackout, stories made reports on the local radio stations almost immediately, and the local news by the following morning. It wasn't the top story, mind you. Not only that, considering how seriously the people handling it were taking the situation and how scary they thought it was, they were surprised it was only a short 2-minute segment. USAMRIID got really lucky. Their operation at the Monkey House officially began on November 30th, 1989. Over the next couple of days, George H.W. Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev formally declared the end of the Cold War at the Malta Conference. The Communist Party collapsed in East Germany. Alfred Herrhausen, a German banker working on the economic integration of East and West Germany, was assassinated by communists. On top of that, there was a military coup attempt in the Philippines. Who cared about a bunch of monkeys? The next day, the team went through killing the monkeys. Their most humane way possible involved a mixture of 3 drugs. The first being ketamine, to make the already depressed monkeys completely docile and in charge of Twitter. Then a really powerful sedative called Rompun. That's just to put them to sleep. Then for the coup de grace, T61. It's a drug you've probably never heard of, but if you've ever had a beloved pet that had to be put down, you know what it does. And remember the door that I mentioned earlier? The one to the room that was supposed to be totally sealed off? Dan Dahlgaard used it to go in to talk to the army officers, while wearing nothing but normal clothes and a respirator, which made the jaws of the army team drop. This was just one of the many, many problems that made the first day of decontamination a spectacular clusterfuck. There were people bumping into each other or snagging their pressurized suits on things which required them to clumsily tape them back together. To make matters worse, when Dahlgaard was leaving for the night, he saw one of the few remaining Hazelton lab workers in the parking lot still in their gear. He had told everyone to at least wear a mask, if not some kind of protective covering in the building, but not to be seen wearing them outside. But to make things worse, this guy was puking his guts out. Dahlgaard got the guy inside and told him not to leave the building. Then Dahlgaard and Volt looked all over to find a thermometer that had either been sterilized or not been used on the monkeys. They couldn't find one, so they had to go out and buy one. They found the patient had a very high fever. Dahlgaard contacted his bosses, saying he wanted the entire lab shut down and evacuated. Finally, people responded reasonably. In a movie, the executives would say, "Yeah, but profits though." But that's not what happened. They agreed. Though their logic was motivated by a degree of self-interest. If people start getting sick, or worse dying, Hazelton Labs or maybe its corporate parent Corning Corporation would be on the hook for it. Better hand full responsibility for the entire mess over to the army. So they contacted Peters about it. Peters said, "I'll have to run this up the chain of command." After all, the term full responsibility can mean many things. Full responsibility goes to the army? Who in the army? Some of those responsibilities, in the case of illness or death, would be lawsuits. Peters didn't have the authority to do anything that would open the army up to that kind of thing. As for the sick patient, the CDC got involved. McCormick said to take the worker to Fairfax County Hospital. Peters disagreed. McCormick insisted he had treated Ebola patients in Africa for weeks and didn't get sick. If you isolated the patient and kept up level 3 quarantine procedures, there was very little risk of the virus getting out to the public. Peters, on the other hand, said that the army had portable containment pods that they could use to get the guy to Fort Detrick. They had a facility there called the Slammer. It's small, cramped, but it has access to the strictest quarantine equipment known to exist, and every medication they could name and then some. McCormick reminded him of their previous agreement. Under no circumstances was the United States Army to deal with human patients of whatever strain of Ebola this virus turned out to be. They were only authorized to deal with the monkeys. For his part, Peters accepted this and pointed out that if the virus got loose in Fairfax Hospital like it had in hospitals in Africa, then it was McCormick's head on the political chopping block, not Peters. McCormick was willing to take that risk. After that, these two men who could ordinarily argue for days about things like this both agreed that nothing more needed to be said. Meanwhile, the media blackout was so effective that a camera crew from WRC-TV News 4, Washington, D.C.'s NBC affiliate, was right at the door to the lab when the patient was transported from the lab in Reston to Fairfax Hospital. After that, the issue of responsibility really began to drag on Hazelton. They insisted the Army take responsibility for anything going forward. They faxed Peters some legal documents. Reluctantly, he and General Russell signed them without going through Army lawyers. That way, if things went sideways, the Army could argue that these men were acting without authorization, and the contract's validity was in fact somewhat questionable. Just like that, the Army was responsible for an entire lab and 450 monkeys, all of which would have to be euthanized. To get the operation done as quickly as possible, they had to pull from other departments at Fort Detrick, which meant training a bunch of freshly commissioned privates in the equivalent of a 20-minute tutorial on how to run a biohazard operation. Now, this might seem odd for the portion of the Army charged with researching, treating, and containing highly contagious viruses, but no such training existed. They had to make it up on the fly. But they worked out a system. Everybody had a buddy, everyone watched out for their buddy, and themselves. Check for tears or leaks in the suit every 10 minutes. If you feel ill, report it immediately and prepare for extraction. Take a break every few hours to prevent exhaustion. Not only that, there were a few other problems that required getting people to help. The first being that the Army, in its infinite wisdom, thought that if you were handling something like anthrax or Ebola in a proper quarantine suit, that wasn't dangerous. Thus, anyone participating in such operations was not entitled to hazard pay. This means they got typical minimum wage for the time. Thus, these young officers were risking everything, exposing themselves to the Ebola virus for little over minimum wage. Second, they had to turn down a lot of people who wanted to do it. Most of them because they had a history of claustrophobia. At least one other because she was pregnant. They got into the building, and the whole place was so disgusting that it was probably even worse than a college dorm room. The whole building smelled of piss and shit. In the human work areas, desks and chairs were in disarray as the employees had fled fast. The monkey pens were worse. The whole room was covered in every bodily fluid. These monkeys were dying, and everyone knew it. Which makes something that happened next somewhat surprising. Jerry Jacks fed the monkeys. While yes, he and the Army were there to kill them, he thought that the mission directive said to eliminate them in the most humane way possible. There was nothing humane about letting some of them starve in the hours or even days it could take to complete the operation. That seems to be a bit of a contrast to the speech the troops were given about not becoming attached to the macaques. Their mission to not consider what they were doing as killing the monkeys, but rather potentially protecting human lives and easing the monkeys' suffering would instead cause the monkeys to experience a slow and painful death. Now, we're all familiar with the idea of an assembly line. When you build a car, for instance, it is faster to have one person bolt hundreds of tires in a day than to have them put together one car themselves. Well, USAMRIID had a similar idea to handle the sheer number of monkeys. They set up a room so the blood wouldn't leak into the public water supply. Then 2 people would inject the monkey with the initial drug to make them docile. Then 2 people would fully put them to sleep. The next 2 people would provide the lethal dose of medication, and instead of putting the monkeys together, the next 2 would perform an autopsy on the monkey and collect the samples. Overall, the first day of the fully staffed operation went better than expected, but their luck didn't hold. On day 2, one female soldier had a problem with the battery in her suit's air blower system, meaning fresh air was cut off, and she might have been briefly exposed to contaminated air. Worse, when she and her buddy went out, a micro tear was found in her suit. Luckily, it was found her suit never lost pressure. And in another bout of good luck, even though the news teams kept showing up, for some reason they only checked the front of the building, never the back. It was only laziness that prevented footage of people entering the world's first full-scale biocontainment op from being the top story on the evening news. It seems like even real life is a fan of the narrative 3-act structure, because the third day was the most action-packed. Back at USAMRIID, a researcher named something Polish was working on the quarantine suits in level 4 containment, trying to develop a quick test for Ebola. While the CDC claimed they already had one, the Army wasn't taking chances and was working on their own. They got their hands on the blood of the guy who was blowing chunks in the parking lot. They assumed he had to have Ebola, so they used it as a test. It didn't seem to work. Meanwhile, this most strenuous day provided a comic interlude as one of the monkeys escaped its pen and started running around the lab and hiding behind cages and things. Some people say it escaped the room, others say that it didn't, while others said it would leave the room briefly and come back and bang on the cages. Not only that, the poor thing's feet were bleeding. What is known is that many of the USAMRIID officers had to chase the thing with nets. They considered shooting it. After all, if they hit it, boom, end of the problem, for the monkey and the people. The problem was, if they missed it, it could ricochet and breach someone's suit, in a room almost painted with Ebola-infected blood. Not to mention the fact that a missed shot could scare the monkey. Most monkeys, including crab-eating macaques, have really sharp teeth. They could make quick work of the protective suits. Even if the monkey wasn't infected with a deadly virus, getting bitten would hurt like hell. Some of the more experienced officers knew this from their past work in the lab. They wound up being unable to catch the monkey, so they simply locked it in a room and would deal with it in the morning. While all of this was going on, C.J. Peters was coming into work. He noticed someone hanging around outside the building. Peters asked him why, and it was a reporter for the Washington Post. Peters didn't tell him anything more than what had already been in the very limited press release that had already been made. He didn't guide the guy to the back of the building. He did his best Jedi mind trick to try to convince him, this is not the monkey lab you're looking for. Move along. It seems like something out of a farce, well, until you realize that if the monkey that got loose had bitten someone, there was almost zero chance the person wouldn't catch Ebola, nor was that the only close call while they were euthanizing all the monkeys. Still, day 3 was the day they got most of the monkeys killed. Though some of the monkeys, USAMRIID didn't have to do them in themselves. As fast as their disassembly line was, it still wasn't that fast. Some of the monkey deaths were the virus taking its course. It was also around the time that Yarling and Gijsbert really began to hope they were out of the woods. If this was normal Ebola, they were nearing the end of their incubation period, and they had no symptoms yet. Well, assuming that it wasn't a variant that was so different from the versions of Ebola they knew about that it didn't play by the same rules. December 7th has rarely been thought of as a lucky day for the United States military. It is, after all, a day that will live in infamy. But in this case it was. Though, according to Richard Preston's account, it was a bit of a mixed bag for Nancy Jacks. On a personal level, her father died. On the other hand, it was the day she and her team down at Fort Detrick got their first load of monkeys for examination. Not only were the monkeys triple-bagged and contained, they had information about what room they were taken from. They could take samples. Now would come the hard work of tracing where in the building the virus had spread and how quickly. It was the last day the monkeys were killed at the Reston lab. Yes, even the one that got away. Almost everyone seemed relieved. Everyone had seemed to get through the hardest part without any major accidents. Then came what turned out to be the hard part, the cleanup. The monkeys had been left without much care and minimal food for several days. The walls were painted with piss and shit. All of that would have to be taken care of before the biggest job of decontamination could be done. They got pallets and chisels and other equipment for removing paint to do that job, and then they had to do it in bulky contamination suits. They checked the refrigerators as well. Inside they found the frozen corpses of the original 15 monkeys. The bodies were frozen solid. They were posed so that they could fit in a fridge. They were stuck that way. Not wanting to snap the bodies and splatter infected blood everywhere, the corpses were so stiff they had to be defrosted for a day before they could even be put in a containment pod. There's also the question of, what do you do with the bodies of over 450 Ebola-infected monkeys? Well, it turns out monkeys dying either in shipping to the lab or in the course of the experiments was not uncommon. Hazelton owned a medical-grade incinerator just for that sort of thing. I just hope the people who ran it got overtime. Again, based on the assumption that this virus was a known form of Ebola, which is something they still weren't sure about, Gijsbert and Yarling made it through incubation without any trouble. The same day, CDC tests determined that the guy from the parking lot did not have Ebola, but rather a completely unrelated, coincidental, serious case of the flu. This really confused Gijsbert and Yarling. They knew it was Ebola, since the test for Ebola Zaire reacted. It burned its way through the systems of monkeys like it was nothing, but with human beings, it didn't seem to do anything at all. They compared it to the Michael Crichton novel and movie, The Andromeda Strain, which people today think was based on the first Ebola outbreak, but it wasn't. Crichton's novel came out in 1969, and the movie was released 2 years later in 1971. Ebola wasn't discovered until 1976. Anyway, all the monkey bodies and samples were removed. The walls were scraped down so far that it took the paint with it, and every possible surface was drenched in bleach. The final part of the cleanup might seem counterintuitive. They introduced some bacteria. They scattered little bits of paper with a bacteria called Bacillus subtilis niger. This is a very clever move. Bacillus subtilis niger is completely harmless and very hard to kill, which is why the army needed to use it. Then, MacGyvering their way through this operation, they got out a giant sunbeam electric frying pan laced with tiny crystals. When boiled, the crystals would produce formaldehyde gas. Most of us are familiar with formaldehyde as a preservative agent for human bodies. In a gaseous state, it is incredibly toxic. They blasted the gas everywhere. The wall, computers, copy machines, the sinks, name a place you would find in a lab that gas went there. After the gas was given the chance to do its job, the USAMRIID team went back in there with containment suits to check on the Bacillus subtilis niger. Their logic was if the formaldehyde gas killed the Bacillus subtilis niger, then it was almost certain that it took out the Ebola. Sure enough, they didn't find any bacteria. If you think that's the end, well, I'm sorry, but our pseudo-cinematic adventure engages in quite a bit of sequel baiting. First, about a month later, Hazelton Labs was up and running again and got a new batch of monkeys. They went on the cheap and got monkeys from the same supplier, who got them from the same Philippine island as before, and, well, whatever the word is for doing the same thing over and over but expecting a different result ensued. Only this time, Hazelton called the Army and the CDC. They still weren't sure if they had a new virus on their hands. It was decided that they would leave food out for the monkeys, close up shop, document the life cycle of the virus, and clean up again when all was said and done. Furthermore, one of the Hazelton Labs workers who did the autopsy on the monkey cut his thumb. He got exposed to Ebola. But since he was a human, the CDC was in charge of his treatment. They didn't lock him up in containment like the army would have. They let him run around. He went to bars and the movies. He even got minor surgery during his incubation period. But nobody got sick. Weirder still, upon further inspection, both the guy who had the heart attack, the guy who puked in the parking lot, and at least one other employee who worked with the monkeys all seemed to have caught Ebola after all, and showed few to no symptoms. Okay, so they did have a new strain of Ebola on their hands. That made sense, since there wasn't any logical way those monkeys could have picked up Ebola Zaire. But it was sort of the best case scenario. It seemed that this third strain, termed Ebola restin, or the restin virus, didn't affect humans at all, just monkeys. Who knows how the operation would have gone without that stroke of luck? Many at the army don't declare this whole thing a dodged bullet. After all, only one of those people who got infected had a cut. The only other means of transmission they could think of was the air. That was frightening. After all, this strain might not appear to affect humans, but it could infect them and reproduce in them. Who's to say that given enough time a similar mutation couldn't arise in Marburg, Ebola Sudan, or Ebola Zaire? Plus, it's genetically and structurally similar enough to Ebola Zaire that you often get false positives for Zaire when testing for restin, and vice versa. Hazelton Labs faced issues after that. Their lab space was rented, and their landlords were not that happy with all the hoopla concerning the army and hundreds upon hundreds of dead monkeys, so they got evicted. On top of this, new improved standards were put in place for the importation of monkeys. Hazelton and a few other companies were accused of circumventing several rules that were already in place. Even the Army and some members of the CDC publicly saying that Hazelton obeyed protocol by calling the proper authorities to take care of it didn't help matters too much. Hazelton was forced to close the facility. It lay unused for several years. The building was torn down, and a daycare now sits in its place. Now, I'm not sure if this is true or not, but at least according to local legend, the very spot where the monkey pens were is now a playground, complete with monkey bars. Nor were these the only two instances of restin virus. It turns out it wasn't even the first. It was first recognized in Reston, Virginia. However, the CDC did what it does best, tracking the origin of the virus. The CDC contacted the distributor, who said they got them from Amsterdam. No, they don't have wild macaques in the Netherlands. They in turn got them from the Philippines. Once the CDC talked to officials there, they were able to discover that they had been dealing with an outbreak for months. Hence, the next shipment of monkeys Hazelton got after the cleanup was infected with the virus as well. Another simultaneously occurring outbreak was at a lab in Texas. There was another Texas outbreak in 1996, plus two more in the Philippines in 2008 and 2015. Then, in 2014-2016, we got another sequel, as a strain of Ebola Zaire had a massive outbreak throughout Africa. There were 4 cases that made it to U.S. shores, leading to 1 death. However, in the interim, it was discovered that USAMRIID was wrong and the CDC was correct. Ebola restin was an outlier in 2 ways. Most Ebola strains can cause lethal infection in animals and humans. Unless someone is already immunocompromised, they are unlikely to catch, let alone die, from restin. But not only that, Ebola Zaire and Marburg viruses can only transmit through the exchange of bodily fluids. Recently, we've gotten another potential sequel when Elon Musk, under the auspices of Doge, shut USAID and its programs designed to treat and prevent the spread of Ebola. Not just restin, all forms of Ebola. The firings have been stopped by the courts and they claim everyone would be rehired, but again, who knows if that will happen. And that's it. That's the Ebola restin virus. I know I made a lot of comparisons to movies for all this, and that's by design. If all of this seems vaguely familiar to you, there's probably a reason for that. For a news story that was mostly buried by the major media outlets of the time and didn't really get a grain of public notoriety until Richard Preston released his book The Hot Zone 4 years later in 1994, it's had quite a life in popular culture. Before Preston's book even hit shelves, 20th Century Fox secured the movie rights. Warner Brothers lost a bidding war, and they didn't take it lying down. While using the actual book to write the script wouldn't be legal, doing their own research would be. Rival studios rushing out 2 similar blockbusters around the same time is pretty common. Unlike a work of fiction, like say Deep Impact and Armageddon, Ebola restin was a real event. If Warner Brothers could rush their movie to theaters before 20th Century Fox could get the Hot Zone out, Fox would have no grounds for a lawsuit. Hence, Warner Brothers rushed their 1995 hit Outbreak to theaters. This caused Fox to not make their Hot Zone movie at all, though it did eventually get a TV miniseries decades later from National Geographic. But that's not the only case of this incident infecting our popular media, as it were. TV producer Chris Carter handled stories loosely inspired by the Ebola arrest incident not once but twice, the first being in several episodes of his 90s super hit The X-Files. Apart from the mind control and incubation of alien-human hybrids, many of the symptoms of the black oil virus mimic that of Ebola, or at least the mythologized version of Ebola presented to us by Richard Preston, which captured the public imagination. However, a few years later, on his other TV series Millennium, there was a plotline about an actual strain of Ebola that, while it infected half the eastern seaboard and killed hundreds of people, was found to be far less deadly than Ebola Zaire and Marburg when the season wrapped up. It did in fact mirror worries that many at the CDC and USAMRIID feared could really happen if Ebola restin would ever mutate. As far as anyone knows, it was still out there, just floating in the air waiting for the right gene to have a transcription error during the replication process. If you liked this episode, please check out Parody Error Films, link is in the description. This was a real-life story that Jess, their head writer and star, really wanted to tell himself, but nobody watches his channel. Most of his viewers want goofy movie reviews, wacky video essays, the occasional short film, and lots of bloopers. I, Tor, think this is the darkest episode I've ever done. He didn't think it would be a good fit there, and he was right. His channel is pretty different, but he's a damn good writer, as you can tell, and I personally like his pair of episodes about insane Christmas specials. Most of his cast have said that their 2-part review of Bible Man are their best episodes, and they're definitely up there. And if you want him to come back and write another episode for me, let both of us know. I'm sure he'd be more than happy to. He's already pitched me on a few ideas. We'll see how this one does. Though, if he does another one, I'd owe him one. I'm not sure that's a good idea. He'd probably want me to put on a straw hat and do my bad southern accent from the JFK and John Brinkley episodes to play Huck Finn in his skits during his review of The Adventures of Mark Twain or something. But I'm pretty sure he's the guy that everyone was seeing in their dreams a few years back, so I don't want to know what'll happen if I defy him.
Believe in something right, but you do something wrong. The loaded question will break your bones, what puts you on your knees. You paint the walls in red, the color of your heart, but the man in gray will get you now. You've got to hide or take the blame.